companies. Sportpesa said they are extremely disappointed by the recent actions by Betting Control and Licensing Board and the Licensing Board to block our payments despite the existence of a court order. We wish to assure our customers and stakeholders that we are challenging these actions. The gaming companies largely rely on Safaricom to take bets, communicate with users, and process payments on the M-Pesa mobile cash platform. So quite a lot of toing and froing there. And as we've already discussed, platforms including Sportpesa, Lotto, Shabiki spent 108 billion shillings on advertising in 2017. They are the biggest spenders in the advertising space in Kenya. So it does have a big ramification for the economy in many different ways, not only the issue about whether we should be promoting betting, which is a societal issue, but just if you look at these numbers, they're pretty chunky, aren't they? 200 billion of revenues, that's big. So we need to keep an eye on how that develops. That was the big news really in Kenya. I'm not sure what's happened to people's money that's sitting on their betting accounts, because I saw a report earlier this morning saying if you didn't withdraw it, it was going to vanish into thin air. So be warned. Now turning to Africa, I couldn't resist this headline. Half the world's babies will be born in Africa by 2100. And that's the demographic dividend, that's the population. And you know, we've been speaking about the surge that we're expecting in Africa's population, and you see that 1 out of 2 of every baby born in 2100 will be born in Africa. In the year 2000, there were 3 Europeans for every African. And now we're seeing a complete flip around, and we're going to get to this point as I'm describing. Togo, which many of you might know where it is, it's that sliver of red in West Africa, is issuing a Eurobond, 500 million euros in its first sale of international bonds, as demand for emerging market securities issued in euros soars, according to people familiar with the matter. Togo is a $5 billion economy, so around the size, a little bit bigger than Burundi, if you want a point of comparison. Derives most of its income from agriculture and mining. Got its first credit rating in the past 2 months, a B rating, 5 levels below investment grade, and in line with Nigeria and Egypt. So quite an interesting development, a new country, first time issuer. You remember, or maybe you don't, but we too were a first time issuer, I think in 2014, if I'm not mistaken. So we're seeing more and more African countries come to the Eurobond party, and it gives them another route to raise capital. Ultimately, it's what you do with the capital, the return on your investment. If you borrow 500 million euros, it's how you put that money to work that counts in the end. Now, a country that didn't put its money to work very well is the Republic of Congo, not the DR Congo. It's just across the Congo River. The African Development Bank want to build a bridge across that river to connect Kinshasa with the capital of the Republic of Congo. But they've had to go to the IMF for a bailout, and the IMF has approved a $449 million bailout for the Republic of Congo. They suffered a sharp drop in the price of oil in 2014. Debt levels, debt to GDP is now 118%, and they really needed Madame Lagarde to step in. Madame Lagarde, of course, is probably on her way to take over the European ECB central bank, but she's still currently at the IMF. So the issue was around Chinese debt. They had $2.56 billion equivalent of Chinese debt at the end of March. and they've restructured that Chinese debt. And the interesting development is that although the restructuring is reducing the interest rate, lengthening the maturity of the payback, but China will not take a haircut. That means if they borrowed $1 billion, they're going to have to pay $1 billion. A haircut is when you borrow, and then when you come back to return it, you return less than you borrowed, and that's called the haircut. So this is interesting for countries which have borrowed heavily from China. It tells us China will restructure, but they won't accept a lower principal back. And I think that's an important point for African leaders to appreciate. This is a little bit of a precursor for what we're going to see, a lot of renegotiations with China. The IMF is tacitly accepting that China will not take a haircut on debts to African governments. So interesting, important development. They finally worked out a bailout package for the Republic of Congo. Turning to Zimbabwe, a report in Africa Confidential, which is a weekly magazine that reports on a Friday, they're saying that Zimbabwe is running on empty. Fuel, power, bread shortages are now widespread, and that this is creating panic as the government faces a cash flow crisis. Of course, 2 weeks ago, the government banned the use of foreign currency, and the economy is reeling since that point. This was a picture from the election time, but essentially the big problem in Zimbabwe is this. This is the rate of inflation. It's close to 100%. That is a laboratory experiment. If you're living in a country with 100% inflation rate, problems are tremendous. And this is probably the second highest inflation rate in the world. Top must be Venezuela, second is Zimbabwe, and I think third is Sudan at the moment. And this is the problem they're suffering from. And it's going to be very, very long journey back, and I'm just not sure that the current regime have the wherewithal to make that recovery. Eskom, which is the KenGen of South Africa, has been given a rescue option by PIC, and PIC is proposing to swap their debt that they're holding in Eskom into equity. Eskom holding debt, they're holding $6.4 billion of debt. This is PIC, this is the pension fund, South African pension fund. More than 1 million workers, South African workers, pay into the PIC. They manage about $150 billion of assets. And essentially, this is the biggest problem for Ramaphosa to sort out. Eskom has more than $32 billion of debt at the moment. 70% of it is guaranteed by the South African government, and it is essentially Cyril Ramaphosa's biggest problem. The monopoly utility can't sell enough power to cover its costs, needs to cut 2/3 of its workforce, and hasn't properly maintained its coal plants. Tahir Maper, the PSA's Deputy General Manager for Members Affairs, says, "We believe Eskom is nuclear waste. The state should take over their mess." And the question is whether they're going to do that or not. But the market has taken this as a positive development. The rand has gotten stronger. But this is really the key challenge in terms of the parastatal sector. This is a phenomenon we've seen across the continent, but in South Africa under President Zuma, it went several notches worse, and now Ramaphosa is having to pick up the pieces. Staying with South Africa, this is a photograph of Cape Town. It was voted Africa's best city. It beat Cairo, and actually the best African and Middle Eastern city, and Tel Aviv as well. Very beautiful place to visit if you ever get the chance. It was ahead of Cairo and Marrakesh. emerging markets, this is a composite of emerging market currencies, and you can see they slumped in May and until the middle of June. That's when the Federal Reserve started talking differently about US interest rates, and that helped these currencies rally. They're at the highest level for 6 months, and that's an interesting development to keep an eye on. It hit the strongest levels versus the dollar since the end of January, according to Morgan Stanley index data. Turning to commodities, the US is pushing for sanctions on China for buying Iranian oil. Senior administration officials now agree that China defied US sanctions. China says that they do not accept the legal validity of US sanctions, and the US is trying to find some way to punish them because the US wants to reduce Iranian oil exports to zero under Trump. And the US State Department has considered issuing a waiver allowing Chinese companies to receive Iranian oil as payment in kind for their investment in an Iranian oil field, but that idea has been abandoned. And then there are hawks in the administration, and these hawks are saying they're pushing for the US to impose secondary sanctions on Chinese entities, and such a move would obviously complicate trade talks between the two countries. Those trade talks seem to have died a death after that G20 meeting between Xi and Trump. And it seems that the Chinese are not that interested in having these trade talks. That's what I'm reading from the wires. The United Kingdom, do you remember they said they accused the Iranians of interfering, of using Iranian naval boats to interfere with an oil tanker of theirs. They sent this boat, which is the HMS Montrose, to come between the Iranian boats and the British ship, and then escorted the British ship into safe waters. But the British have raised the threat level to critical for UK ships in Iranian waters. And that's a significant increase in the threat level. And this comes to my point that, the Iranians don't have to shut the Strait of Hormuz. Let me show you the Strait of Hormuz again. The Strait of Hormuz is just here. It's tiny. It's a little. It's where 1/4 of the world's oil passes. There you have Iran. Here you have Dubai and Oman. And essentially, it's this area we're talking about. This is where these incidents are happening. And the point I'm making, it would be foolish of the Iranians to shut it down completely, because you can imagine the US would just bomb them out of the sea in the space of a blink of an eye. But here what they're doing is just staying just below a complete shuttering of the strait. They're raising the insurance costs of moving oil through there. And that is a very clever, sophisticated, asymmetric response. And you're basically making it very, very expensive to move oil through this zone. And no one wants to insure these ships as they come through here. 1/4 of the world's oil supply passes through there. And that's why I said the Iranians will surely manage to shutter the Straits of Hormuz. Even I use the phrase asymmetric fashion. An asymmetric fashion is you don't shut it down, you don't park your boats there, but you make it impossible for people to come through. And I think they've done that quite effectively. And because of those developments, the price of crude oil, you can see that here, has risen in the last week about 7.5% and gone over $60 a barrel. Of course, we're not near the highs that we were earlier in the year, but we're still climbing up. We're nowhere near the lows now, and the market is trending higher, as you can see, as this concern about geopolitics and about passage in the Middle East continues to increase. So Richard Branson, there you go. He's got a very, I haven't been there, but he's got a very lovely place in the Masai Mara. I think that was the day he opened it. And he is warning that the pound will collapse if the UK leaves Europe under a hard Brexit scenario. And this is what Boris Johnson, who's a shoo-in to be the Prime Minister, is saying. Johnson is saying, look, come what may, we're leaving. And Branson is saying, if you do that, the pound will collapse. And he's talking about the pound collapsing to parity with the dollar, which means that it would be at about 100 to the shilling as well. And we haven't seen that level for eternity. I can't even remember when the pound was 100 shillings to the pound. But he's predicting a very sharp fall in the British currency if the UK leaves without a deal. And that's what Boris Johnson seems ready to do. Germany, this is interesting. Look at this. This is the interest costs of German debt. So, in the year 2000, they were spending about 3% or close to 3% of their GDP on interest. It would be interesting for us to know what percentage of GDP we're spending on interest. I'm sure it's much, much higher than that. But the point is, it's now coming all the way down to zero. And at this rate, they're going to be paying nothing for the money that they're borrowing. If you look at it overall, I'm sure our Treasury Secretary, Henry Rotich, would love to be in the position that the Germans are in. And a number of other countries are in a similar position, Japan as well. And this is what Trump is constantly complaining about with the Federal Reserve. Now turning to Bitcoin, this is a lot of news coming out about Bitcoin. So let's start first of all. This is the price of Bitcoin this year. You know, we were down here around $4,000. Do you remember when we first started talking about it? Then we started to jump up. We got as high as 6,000. That was in May. Then from 6,000 we hit 8,000 by June. And now we're somewhere around between 11 and 12,000. So it's been a phenomenal performance. There are very few asset prices. Actually, let me tell you which ones. Zoom, which is an online conferencing web application, that's up about 90 or 100%. Snapchat, which is a communication platform, where your messages evaporate after 24 hours, that's up about 150%. But top of the list is Bitcoin, and I think that's why we spend a lot of time on this whole thing. Now, the Federal Reserve, and this is the point I've been making about it, saying it's a safe haven asset. You're never going to buy a pizza with Bitcoin. If you are, you're mad, right? You're buying Bitcoin because you see it as the digital alternative to gold. It's a way of keeping your money safe, hopefully finding price appreciation, and that's what's creating the interest. And now the Federal Reserve is confirming what I've already said, saying people see it as an alternative to gold. And he called it a store of value. JP Morgan has already planned to launch its own digital coins, but Trump took a completely different stance with it. So this is, this is an example of these server farms where they are mining Bitcoin. Right? And apparently, according to a report I've just seen, Bitcoin consumes more energy than Switzerland. Isn't that amazing how much electricity is being consumed? Now, Trump on Thursday criticized Bitcoin and Facebook's Libra digital coin and other cryptocurrencies. He says, I'm not a fan of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies which are not money and whose value is highly volatile and based on thin air, he said. If Facebook and other companies want to become a bank, they must seek a new banking charter and become subject to all banking regulations, just like other banks, both national and international. He says it's not money, and basically saying that Trump said Libra has little standing or dependability. And he finally concluded by saying we have only one real currency in the USA, and it is stronger than ever. It is called the United States dollar. The US Federal Reserve added that they're creating a working group that is going to consider the implications of Facebook's planned virtual currency Libra. Powell, Federal Reserve Chairman, said that the cryptocurrency plan raises serious questions. And further than that, we've had about a $32 million theft of Bitcoin from one of the exchanges as well. And then China police have been busting Bitcoin miners for stealing $3 million in electricity. So we got a lot going on in the cryptocurrency space, but the main takeaway is that the regulator, whether it's the Bank of France, whether it's the Federal Reserve, whether it's the Chinese, or whether it's the Japanese, are all beginning to start to get a little bit nervous and pushing back on what they think is a wild west of digital currencies. So keep an eye on those developments, and remember that there is a lot of theft that goes on in this digital space. So you can make a lot of money, but you need to be able to hang on to it. And that, I can't assure you can, given what we see happening. Trump here says that the cryptocurrency is not money, as you can see. And essentially that's the Bitcoin, that's the dollars. And he said we have only one real currency in the USA, and it's called the dollar. Now let me turn to the US market. Market is expecting the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates by a quarter point. Inflation is at 2.1%. Unemployment 3.7%. That is putting economies, because 3.7% of people are looking for a job or change jobs or something. GDP 2.4%. This is not the type of environment that a central bank should be cutting interest rates. This is a fact. In all my life, I could say that if these were the economic numbers coming out of the US, you would not expect a rate cut. And this is something to bear in mind. And I think if the Federal Reserve cuts rates, which the market thinks is a shoo-in and a certainty, the risk is they're going to have to increase rates by more than they cut it this year, next year. And what's going to happen next year is Trump is going to an election. So I think for all his bashing of the Federal Reserve, it's actually going to be a political mistake. You don't want to go to elections with rising interest rates, people feeling less well off. That is always a bad signal. So I think this is a really interesting moment in the US economy, and we've got to keep an eye on it. And if they stoke it up now, they're going to have a big problem next year, just as Trump is going for re-election. Singapore came out with GDP data. Look at this. When it's red, it means it's contracting, right? So that's green is growing, red is contracting. And essentially the number, Singapore's economy sent a warning shot to the world economy. GDP shrank at an annualized rate of 3.4%. in the second quarter from the previous 3 months. That's a big slump. And really that speaks to this trade war. They're in the crossfire of the trade war, and it's a lot to do with electronics, the demand for phones, etc. That's why South Korea also is significantly under pressure. But really this might be the canary in the coal mine, as it were. And now let me turn to Salman Rushdie here. This is a very famous writer. Do you remember the Iranians put out a fatwa on him because he wrote a book called The Satanic Verses, which was meant to be about the Quran, and the Ayatollah, the previous one, got very upset with him and put out a fatwa. He's still alive. But he said this, he said, ours is the most cryptic of centuries, its true nature, a dark secret. And I think that's quite a powerful comment he made there. But now I want to finish off this first half. This is the British High Commissioner to the United States. Okay, essentially his name is he is stepped down, and that's because some of the reports he was sending back to the United Kingdom, which are meant to go in the diplomatic pouch. And the diplomatic pouch is something you probably have heard of, and it's meant to be that, you know, a diplomat can say whatever he wants about the country he's living in, because no one else is going to read it, and his leaders back home need to hear the unvarnished truth. That's what a diplomatic pouch does. That's what a high commissioner and an ambassador is meant to do. He's meant to give his home government a clear perspective, unvarnished, truthful. And he said some things about Trump. He said, that Trump was insecure. He said he was very, very negative about him. And in an article I was reading, it says the betrayal of our man in Washington sends a message to every British diplomat and every diplomat worldwide. If this is how the leaders are going to treat you, don't criticize the dictators or their cops or their torturers. Stick to the cocktail circuit, and whatever you do, don't tell the truth. And then in the same article, the writer is speculating, saying, can you imagine if the leaker gets his hands on the diplomatic bag from Riyadh, what would be said as well? And then he's speculating about Turkey, saying, imagine what would happen with Turkey. Turkey today took delivery of this Russian S-400 anti-missile system. And essentially, Trump has been warning Turkey, because Turkey is in the NATO camp, not in the Russian camp, that if he did this, there are going to be sanctions. And given that only last weekend he sacked his central bank chief, if Trump imposes sanctions on Turkey, you're going to see a very, very violent sell-off. And I would have thought it is entirely predicted and predictable that that's exactly what Trump is going to do. And I think the problem for Erdogan is largely that he's lost control of the economy, and this might well be the straw that breaks the camel's back. We will come back to you in the second half. This is The Smart Investor, Metropole TV. My name is Ali Khan Sachu, and we're going to take a deep dive into the platform economy from the other side, from the employees. They're no longer called employees. We have to find the correct name for them, because they're part of the gig economy that people talk about. We got two guests coming in to talk to us about a proposed strike by a lot of these drivers on particularly the taxi apps, and I'm really looking forward to that conversation. We've spoken to the CEO of Little. We've looked into Uber. I'm bullish about Uber as a stock, but I really am looking forward to hearing what these guys are going to say. Join us after the break to hear what's really going on the ground. I, of course, am a consumer. I don't never use the car anymore. I just pick up the phone. I want to hear what these boys have got to say. Join us after the second half. Join us after the break.